The cruelest part wasn't that he kissed me. It was that I became the only person left in the world who remembered it. People always say memories fade with time, but no one ever tells you what happens when a memory stays perfectly alive inside your heart while disappearing from someone else's. Every morning at exactly 7:15, Adrian Hayes walked into Hollow Oak Café wearing the same charcoal overcoat, the same calm expression, and the same quiet confidence that made everyone instinctively move aside without realizing they were doing it. He ordered a large black coffee, thanked whoever happened to be behind the counter, and left exactly 4 minutes later. It was almost comforting how predictable he had become. Almost. Because every single morning, he looked directly into my eyes with polite familiarity instead of recognition. To him, I was simply Ethan Brooks, another barista who somehow always remembered his order before he spoke. To me, he was the man whose lips had brushed mine exactly 43 days ago beneath the glowing string lights outside the Winter Lantern Festival, the man who had smiled in a way I had never seen before, whispered my name like it was something precious, and then disappeared into a tomorrow where none of it had ever happened. Sometimes, I wondered if I had imagined the entire evening. The human mind can play cruel tricks when hope gets involved. But I still remembered the smell of cinnamon drifting through the cold December air. I remembered the choir singing old Christmas songs across the square. I remembered how snowflakes had settled in Adrian's dark hair while he laughed after I accidentally spilled hot chocolate across my gloves. Most of all, I remembered the silence that followed when our conversation stopped feeling like two friends talking and started feeling like two lonely people finally finding the courage to be honest. He had looked at me with silver-gray eyes that reflected every tiny holiday light around us, stepped closer without hesitation, and gently kissed me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reckless. It was quiet enough that the world kept moving without noticing, yet somehow loud enough to change everything inside me. The next morning, everything had changed again. Adrian called to apologize for canceling breakfast because he had spent the night in the emergency room after slipping on an icy sidewalk while driving home. The doctor said he had a mild concussion and should recover quickly. Recover. Funny word. He recovered perfectly. His headaches disappeared. His balance returned. His work schedule resumed. The only thing that never came back was us. The first time I mentioned the festival, confusion crossed his face so naturally that my stomach tightened. "I don't think I made it there," he had answered with an apologetic smile. "Honestly, I barely remember that entire evening." I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he needed time. But days became weeks, and weeks became 43 mornings of watching someone remember every detail about his business meetings, his favorite coffee, even the name of the elderly customer who brought her golden retriever every Friday, while forgetting the single moment that had quietly rearranged my entire future. And somehow, the hardest part wasn't wondering whether Adrian still loved me. The hardest part was watching him slowly fall in love with me all over again, without ever realizing he already had once before. I tried to convince myself that forgetting could be an act of mercy. If Adrian truly could not remember that winter night, then maybe he had been spared the confusion that had quietly consumed me ever since. I was the one who replayed every word before falling asleep. I was the one who searched for hidden meaning in every smile he offered across the cafe counter. He never looked uncomfortable around me. He never acted guilty. If anything, he seemed strangely at ease, as though an invisible thread kept pulling him back to my corner of the world. It started with small things that most people would never notice. Instead of rushing out with his coffee, he lingered for another minute, asking how business had been or commenting on the weather outside. One rainy Tuesday he noticed I had switched the bakery display, and he complimented the arrangement before taking his usual seat by the front window. A week later, he surprised me by bringing a small box of blueberry muffins from a bakery across town, because he had heard one of our regular customers mention that I liked comparing recipes. "I figured you would appreciate these," he said with an easy smile. "Tell me if they are actually any good." I stared at the box for a second longer than I should have. That had been our conversation at the festival. I had joked that every baker secretly judged every other baker. Adrian had laughed and promised he would become my official taste tester someday. He had forgotten making that promise, yet somehow his heart seemed determined to keep it. The pattern continued. Whenever I worked the early shift, Adrian appeared a few minutes earlier than before. Whenever another customer kept me occupied, I would catch him quietly waiting instead of leaving immediately. He never complained. He simply watched the morning traffic through the window until I had a free moment to ask how his day was going. My coworkers noticed before I did. "That businessman definitely likes talking to you," Lily whispered one morning while wiping down the espresso machine. I forced a laugh and shrugged. "He is just friendly." She raised one eyebrow. "Nobody smiles like that over black coffee." I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain that his smile had once belonged to me for exactly one unforgettable evening before disappearing into silence. Instead, I simply changed the subject and focused on steaming milk that did not need steaming. Then something happened that left my heart racing all over again. As Adrian reached for his cup one morning, our fingertips brushed for only an instant. His expression changed. The smile faded. His eyes widened ever so slightly, as though he had heard a distant voice calling his name from somewhere beyond reach. He remained completely still for several seconds, staring at my hand instead of the coffee. "Are you all right?" I asked quietly. He blinked and looked up, almost startled to find me standing there. "This is going to sound strange," he admitted with an embarrassed laugh. "Have we met somewhere before this cafe?" Every beat of my heart seemed to echo through the room. I could have answered with the truth. I could have reminded him of the lights, the snow, the choir, and the promise hidden inside one gentle kiss. Instead, fear wrapped itself around every word I wanted to speak. I smiled as naturally as I could and softly replied, "I do not think so." Adrian nodded slowly, but he did not look convinced. As he walked toward the door, he paused with his hand on the handle and glanced back at me one more time, wearing the same thoughtful expression he had carried on the night that changed my life, and for the first time since he had forgotten everything, I realized that maybe memories were not the only things capable of finding their way home. I began avoiding the front register after that morning, volunteering to organize inventory in the kitchen or decorate cakes in the back whenever Adrian usually arrived. It was easier to hide behind racks of fresh bread than to watch hope quietly return to life inside someone who did not understand why his own heart kept leading him back to me. Lily teased me about becoming antisocial, but I laughed it away, blaming holiday orders and endless baking schedules. The truth was much harder to explain. Every unexpected smile from Adrian felt like someone reopening a letter I had spent weeks trying to seal shut. If I stayed close, I would only keep wishing for memories that belonged to a version of him who no longer existed. For 3 mornings in a row, he came into the cafe and looked around before ordering. I watched from the kitchen doorway as his eyes wandered toward the empty register where I usually stood. On the 4th morning, Lily walked into the kitchen carrying an untouched cup of coffee. "Your favorite customer left this for you," she said with a curious grin. "He said you looked tired yesterday." I stared at the warm paper cup. Written across the side in neat black ink were 4 simple words. "Take a break, Ethan." My fingers tightened around the cup because those exact words had once been spoken beside a frozen fountain, while I insisted on helping clean up after the festival instead of enjoying it. Adrian had laughed softly and handed me hot chocolate before saying, "Take a break, Ethan." The world can survive 5 minutes without you. He could not possibly remember saying it, yet somehow the sentence had returned as naturally as breathing. That afternoon, I walked home beneath gray January skies, carrying questions that grew heavier with every step. Maybe memories did not disappear completely. Maybe they simply found new ways to exist. The following Saturday, the café hosted a small community baking workshop for local families. Children covered cookies with colorful frosting, while parents filled the room with cheerful conversations. I stayed busy helping a little girl shape heart-shaped sugar cookies when I heard the front door open. Adrian stepped inside wearing a navy sweater instead of his usual business suit, looking almost younger without the formal jacket. He hesitated after noticing how crowded the cafe had become. "I did not realize there was an event today," he said apologetically. "I can come back another time." Before I could answer, the little girl beside me tugged on my apron. "Mr. Ethan, is that your friend?" Children had a remarkable talent for asking questions adults avoided. Adrian smiled politely. "I hope I am." The words landed more heavily than he intended. I felt my chest tighten as I gestured toward an empty chair near the decorating table. "You are welcome to stay if you do not mind a little chaos." He accepted the invitation with surprising enthusiasm. Within minutes, he was helping children sprinkle colored sugar across cookies, laughing whenever frosting ended up on his hands instead of the pastries. Watching him surrounded by smiling families felt strangely familiar. During the festival, he had quietly stopped to help a lost little boy find his parents before returning to me with snowflakes melting across his coat. Kindness had always been part of him. That had never been forgotten. Near the end of the workshop, one of the children handed Adrian a cookie decorated with uneven blue icing and announced proudly, "You should give this to someone you really like." The entire room chuckled. Adrian looked down at the cookie before lifting his eyes toward me, with an expression that seemed both uncertain and strangely drawn by something invisible. He crossed the room, placed the cookie carefully on the counter in front of me, and smiled with quiet sincerity. "Then I think it belongs here." I thanked him with a smile that barely concealed the storm inside my heart, because for one impossible moment it felt less like meeting someone new and more like watching a forgotten promise slowly find its way back to the person who had never stopped waiting. After that afternoon, I made a promise to myself that felt wise at the time. I would stop searching for hidden meaning in every coincidence. A familiar phrase, an unexpected smile, a thoughtful gesture, none of it mattered unless Adrian actually remembered why they existed. I had spent weeks collecting tiny fragments of hope, only to discover they could disappear as quickly as they appeared. My heart deserved better than living on possibilities. So I built new routines. I accepted extra shifts at the cafe. I signed up for an evening pastry course every Wednesday. I even started jogging through Riverside Park before sunrise, hoping exhaustion would leave less room for memories. It almost worked. Almost. Because somehow Adrian kept appearing in the ordinary corners of my life. One chilly Monday evening, I stopped at Greenfield Market to buy fresh berries before heading home. As I reached for the last carton of strawberries, another hand reached for it at the same time. I looked up and found Adrian standing there with the same surprised expression I probably wore myself. He laughed softly and pulled his hand back. "You take them," he said. "I arrived second. We can split them," I suggested before thinking. The words escaped naturally, as though some older version of us had answered first. His smile widened. "That sounds fair." We stood near the produce section dividing strawberries into 2 paper bags, while an elderly employee watched us with quiet amusement. "You two make a wonderful couple," she said cheerfully before walking away to help another customer. Time seemed to stop for one awkward second. I lowered my eyes toward the shopping basket in my hands, while Adrian rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed smile. People make interesting assumptions, he said. They do, I answered, trying to sound unaffected even though my heartbeat had become impossible to ignore. We walked outside together beneath a sky painted in soft shades of orange and lavender. Instead of saying goodbye immediately, Adrian matched my pace without asking where I was going. The silence between us felt comfortable rather than uncomfortable. Eventually he glanced toward the river reflecting the evening light. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "Do you ever feel like you are missing a chapter from your own life?" The question caught me completely off guard. He looked ahead as he continued speaking. "Ever since my accident, everyone tells me I recovered perfectly. My doctors are happy. My family is happy. My coworkers never notice anything strange. But every now and then I get this feeling that there is a conversation I forgot to finish or a place I was supposed to return to." He smiled awkwardly. "It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud." I swallowed carefully before answering. "It does not sound ridiculous." Adrian looked relieved simply to hear someone agree. "Sometimes I have dreams," he admitted quietly. "Nothing clear. Just lights hanging in the air. Snow falling. Someone laughing nearby. Every time I wake up, I feel happy for a few seconds before realizing I cannot remember why." My feet almost stopped moving. Those were not random images. They belonged to that night. They belonged to us. I wanted to tell him everything. Every instinct inside me begged me to fill the empty spaces his memory had left behind. But another voice reminded me that love could not survive on borrowed memories. If he remembered because I described every detail, would those feelings truly be his? Or would they simply become another story he believed because I asked him to? We reached the corner where our paths separated. Adrian smiled with the same quiet warmth that had become dangerously familiar. "Thank you for listening," he said. "Talking to you always makes the missing pieces feel a little less frightening." I watched him disappear into the evening crowd, carrying his groceries in one hand and questions in the other. Standing there beneath the glowing streetlights, I finally understood the hardest truth of all. I was no longer waiting for Adrian to remember me. I was waiting to find out whether two hearts could recognize each other even after one of them had forgotten the road that first brought them together. The following Friday began like every other morning until someone completely unexpected walked through the café door. He was tall, effortlessly confident, and carried the relaxed smile of someone who made friends without trying. "I hope I am not too early," he said as he approached the counter. "I am looking for Ethan Brooks." I blinked in surprise before recognizing him. "Noah Carter?" His grin grew wider. "I was starting to think you forgot about me." Noah and I had attended the same culinary program years earlier before he moved across the country to work in several award-winning bakeries. We had stayed in touch through occasional messages, but it had been almost 2 years since we had seen each other in person. We laughed as though no time had passed at all. He explained that he had recently accepted a position at a boutique hotel only a few miles away and wanted to surprise me instead of announcing his return. Lily immediately insisted he stay for breakfast, and within minutes we were talking about old classes, ruined recipes, impossible instructors, and the disasters every young baker eventually survived. For the first time in weeks, I caught myself laughing without forcing it. It felt unfamiliar, almost forgotten. Then the front door opened again. I did not need to look up to know who had arrived. Adrian always entered with the same calm rhythm, always paused for half a second to let the cold air settle behind him, and always greeted whoever stood nearest with quiet kindness. This time, however, something changed. His eyes landed on Noah, then shifted toward me as I laughed at another ridiculous story from culinary school. Adrian waited in line as usual, but when I handed him his coffee, his smile seemed quieter than normal. "Looks like you have company," he said. "An old friend," I answered. We finally reunited after a long time. Adrian nodded politely, yet instead of leaving, he remained beside the counter for another moment. Noah noticed him and extended his hand without hesitation. Noah Carter. He introduced himself warmly. Adrian shook his hand. Adrian Hayes. Nice to meet you. The exchange lasted only seconds, but something invisible lingered beneath the surface. Neither man appeared unfriendly. Neither seemed uncomfortable. Yet, I noticed Adrian glance toward Noah several times while pretending to study the pastry display, as though trying to understand why seeing me smile with someone else felt unexpectedly important. Later that afternoon, Noah insisted on walking me home. We wandered through downtown, stopping at a small bookstore and sharing coffee from paper cups despite joking that we spent enough time around caffeine already. As we reached the corner near my apartment building, Noah suddenly became thoughtful. Can I ask you something? He said. I nodded. Who is Adrian? I hesitated. A regular customer. Noah smiled patiently. That is not what I asked. I looked away, searching for an answer simple enough to survive being spoken aloud. He is someone who forgot something important. Noah studied my expression before quietly replying. Judging by the way he looked at you this morning, I do not think whatever he lost stayed lost. I laughed softly, convinced my friend was simply reading too much into an ordinary conversation. But the next morning, Adrian arrived almost 20 minutes earlier than usual. He ordered nothing at first. Instead, he looked around the café until his eyes found me arranging fresh croissants behind the display case. Good morning, he said with an easy smile that somehow carried an unfamiliar trace of nervousness. After a brief silence, he added the question I never expected to hear. Is your friend coming back today? Adrian's question caught me completely off guard. I forced a small smile as I slid a fresh croissant into a paper bag and answered as casually as I could. He probably will. He just started working nearby. Adrian nodded, but instead of looking relieved, he seemed to disappear into his own thoughts. He seems like a good person, he finally said. He is, I replied honestly. He has always been kind. Adrian thanked me for the coffee and walked toward his usual table by the window, yet he never opened the newspaper he carried every morning. Several times I noticed him staring outside without really seeing the street beyond the glass. When he eventually left, he forgot the newspaper completely. I ran after him and called his name. He turned around with an apologetic laugh. I have been unusually distracted lately, he admitted. That is not like me. I handed him the folded paper. As our fingers touched again, the world seemed to pause. Adrian suddenly closed his eyes and pressed one hand against his temple. His breathing became uneven, not from fear but from confusion, as though something invisible had rushed into his mind all at once. Are you all right? I asked, taking a careful step closer. He opened his eyes slowly. I just saw something. His voice had become quieter than I had ever heard it. Not clearly. Just lights hanging above a crowd. Snow falling. Someone laughing because they spilled a drink. My heart pounded so loudly that I barely heard the traffic outside. Those were not random images anymore. They were pieces of the night neither of us had spoken about. Adrian looked embarrassed and shook his head. Forget it. It disappeared the moment I tried to understand it. He smiled politely before walking away, leaving me frozen on the sidewalk with emotions I could no longer control. That evening, I met Noah for dinner at a small neighborhood diner. We shared burgers and fries, while old songs played quietly through the speakers. I tried to focus on ordinary conversation, but Noah noticed my distracted expression almost immediately. Something happened today, he said. It was not a question. I slowly told him about Adrian's strange memories, careful not to reveal every detail I had protected for weeks. Noah listened without interrupting, resting his elbows on the table as though every word mattered. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "Sometimes people do not lose what matters most," he said softly. "Sometimes their minds simply cannot find the door back to it." I looked down at my untouched fries. "What if the door never opens?" Noah smiled with gentle certainty. "Then why is he standing outside it every single day?" His words stayed with me long after we left the diner. 2 days later, the city announced that the annual Winter Lantern Festival would return the following weekend. The same streets would glow with thousands of lights. The same local choir would perform holiday songs. The same cafes would stay open late serving hot chocolate and cinnamon pastries. I stared at the colorful poster hanging in the cafe window, while an uneasy feeling settled over me. That festival had been the beginning of everything. If any place in the world still held the echoes of forgotten memories, it would be there. Before I could decide whether I should avoid it completely, the front door opened and Adrian stepped inside carrying 2 tickets in his hand. He walked directly toward the counter, met my eyes with an expression filled with quiet uncertainty, and asked a question that made my heartbeat stop. "I know this is going to sound strange, Ethan, but would you come to the Winter Lantern Festival with me? I have this feeling that I have been there before with someone who mattered more than I ever realized." For a long moment I could not answer. The tickets in Adrian's hand trembled slightly in the cold air, as though he was just as uncertain as I was. Every instinct told me to protect myself by saying no. If he walked through those glowing streets and still remembered nothing, I did not know whether my heart could survive losing the night for a second time. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something I had not seen since before the accident. Hope. Quiet, fragile hope. I nodded. "I would like that." Adrian smiled with visible relief, and somehow that single expression made the weeks of confusion feel lighter than they had in months. The following Saturday evening the city looked almost exactly as I remembered. Thousands of lanterns floated above the streets, like tiny stars caught between buildings. Music drifted through the winter air while families laughed around food stands selling roasted almonds, warm cider, and fresh cinnamon pastries. Snow had begun falling again, soft enough to settle across coats without rushing anyone indoors. We walked side by side through the crowd without speaking very much. There was no awkwardness between us. Instead, it felt as though silence itself had become part of the conversation. Adrian paused beside a wooden bridge overlooking the frozen pond and looked around slowly. "This place feels familiar," he whispered. "I know I have stood here before." My heartbeat grew louder with every step we took. We wandered past handmade craft booths, holiday lights, and the small stage where a local choir prepared for their evening performance. The first notes of a familiar song echoed across the square. Adrian stopped walking immediately. His breathing caught for just an instant. One hand rose instinctively toward his chest. "This song," he murmured. "I know this song." I remained beside him without saying a word. The choir continued singing while snow drifted through the golden light above us. Adrian closed his eyes, and his expression changed. At first, it was only confusion, then surprise, then something deeper, something almost impossible to describe. He opened his eyes suddenly and looked directly at me. "You were here," he whispered. "You were standing right here." My breath caught. Before I could respond, more memories seemed to rush into him all at once. His gaze shifted toward the cafe at the corner of the square. "Hot chocolate," he said quietly. "You spilled it on your gloves." Another pause. "You laughed because I tried to clean the mess with too many napkins." His voice shook ever so slightly. "You said every baker secretly judged other bakers." Tears blurred my vision before I even realized they had formed. Adrian looked at me with growing disbelief, as though every forgotten moment had been waiting behind one unlocked door. "Ethan," he breathed. "We talked for hours." His eyes widened even more. "I told you I wanted to become your official taste tester." He pressed both hands lightly against his temples, overwhelmed not by pain, but by recognition. Then everything became still. The choir faded into the distance. The crowd disappeared into soft echoes. Adrian stared at me with tears shining in his own eyes, as one final memory found its way home. "I kissed you," he whispered, almost afraid the words might vanish again. "I remember." Every wall I had built around my heart cracked in that single moment. Adrian took one careful step closer, his voice filled with quiet regret. "I did not lose that night because it did not matter. I lost it because my mind could not hold on to the happiest moment I had ever lived. But now I remember your smile, your laugh, the snow, the lights, and the way I walked away believing I had finally found the person I wanted beside me." He reached toward my hand but stopped just before touching it, allowing me the choice he had unknowingly taken away months earlier. "I remember everything," he said softly, "and I have never been more afraid that I remembered too late." For a moment neither of us moved. The snow continued falling around us while the choir finished their final verse, yet it felt as though the entire festival had quietly faded into the background. Adrian's eyes never left mine. They held relief, regret, and a tenderness that was painfully familiar. Months earlier, I would have crossed the distance between us without hesitation. Now my feet remained exactly where they were. I took a slow breath before speaking. "You remember," I said softly. Adrian nodded immediately. "Every minute that came back feels like waking up after losing part of my life." His voice broke with quiet honesty. "I remember what I felt that night, Ethan. I remember choosing you before I even realized I was making one of the most important decisions of my life. I wanted nothing more than to believe that those words could erase everything that had happened since. But memories returning did not erase the mornings I had stood alone behind the café counter pretending my heart was not breaking. They did not erase the countless times I had smiled while watching the person I loved introduce himself to me all over again. I lowered my eyes for a moment before looking back at him. "The memories came back today," I said. "Mine never left." Adrian's expression filled with quiet sorrow. "I know." He finally lowered the hand he had been holding out, respecting the distance I had chosen instead of asking me to close it. That single gesture somehow mattered more than any apology could have. "I cannot ask you to pretend those months never happened," he continued. "I cannot ask you to trust me simply because I finally remember. Trust is something I have to earn, even if losing those memories was never my choice." We walked slowly through the festival without speaking for several minutes. The same lights that had once witnessed the beginning of our story now illuminated a completely different chapter. When we reached the frozen fountain, where we had shared hot chocolate months before, Adrian smiled faintly. "This is where you laughed at me for carrying too many napkins," he said. I smiled despite myself. "You looked convinced you could solve every problem with paper towels." He laughed quietly, and for the first time since recovering his memories, the sound carried no desperation, only gratitude. "I was trying to impress you. You did not need to." The words escaped before I could stop him. Adrian looked at me with gentle surprise, but he did not step closer. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small folded card. "I was planning to give you this before anything came back," he admitted. Inside was a handwritten note and a gift certificate for a small bakery supply store across town. At the bottom he had written, "In case you ever decide to teach me how to bake instead of just letting me taste everything." I looked up at him in disbelief. "You bought this before you remembered?" He nodded. "I did not know why I kept wanting to spend more time with you. I only knew that every day I left the cafe wishing I had found another reason to come back. My heart softened, but it was no longer willing to run ahead of itself. I carefully folded the note and slipped it into my coat pocket. I am not ready to go back to where we were, I admitted honestly. Adrian smiled with quiet understanding instead of disappointment. Then we will not go backward. His voice was calm and certain. We will start where we are now, and I will earn every step forward. As we left the festival together, our hands remained at our sides instead of reaching for each other. Yet for the first time in months the distance between us no longer felt like the end of a story. It felt like the beginning of a choice that both of us would finally be able to make together. The weeks that followed did not feel like a fairy tale. They felt real, and somehow that made them even more meaningful. Adrian never rushed me for answers. He never asked whether I had forgiven him or expected our lives to return to the way they had almost been. Instead, he appeared every morning at exactly 7:15, ordered the same large black coffee, and stayed just long enough to ask how my day was going. Some mornings we spoke for only 2 minutes. Other mornings we shared stories about customers, recipes, work, and the ordinary moments that quietly build a life together. He was no longer trying to recover what we had lost. He was patiently creating something new. No one noticed the difference before I did. One afternoon he smiled as we cleaned the kitchen after closing time. He stopped trying to convince you, he observed. Now he is simply showing you who he is. I realized he was right. Adrian never filled our conversations with apologies anymore because he understood that regret alone could not heal what time had broken. Instead, he remembered the little things. He surprised me with a new pastry cookbook after hearing me mention it only once. He attended my evening baking showcase without telling me in advance, quietly applauding from the back of the room. He even volunteered at the community workshop where children decorated cookies, laughing just as naturally as he had before everything changed. One snowy morning, almost exactly 1 year after the night that had first brought us together, Adrian placed a small paper bag on the café counter before I could hand him his coffee. Inside was a pair of warm winter gloves. I looked at him in surprise. He smiled with gentle amusement. I remembered that someone once spilled hot chocolate all over theirs. I laughed, unable to stop myself. You finally remembered the important detail. I remember all of it now, he answered softly. But I also remember everything that came after. I remember meeting you again without knowing why you already felt familiar. I remember wondering why leaving this cafe every morning felt like leaving something unfinished. Those memories matter too, because they taught me that my heart kept finding you even when my mind could not explain why. We closed the cafe together that evening and walked toward the Winter Lantern Festival once more. The streets glowed with the same warm lights, children laughed beneath the same decorations, and the choir sang the same familiar songs that had quietly changed both of our lives. We stopped beneath the string lights where everything had first begun. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. There was no need. Adrian looked at me with calm certainty instead of fear. Last year, he said, I chose you without knowing how much that choice would mean. This year I know exactly what it means. He waited, giving me every opportunity to step away if I wished. Instead, I closed the distance between us myself. Our embrace was simple, warm, and filled with a quiet trust we had rebuilt one ordinary day at a time. A moment later we shared a gentle kiss beneath the falling snow, not as a promise made in uncertainty, but as one made with open eyes, clear memories, and willing hearts. When we finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead lightly against mine and smiled. This time, he whispered, I will remember every second. Looking around at the glowing lanterns, the drifting snow, and the life continuing all around us, I realized something I had spent an entire year searching for. Love is not measured by the moments we never lose. It is measured by the moments we choose to find again, even after life asks us to begin from the very beginning. And this time, we both knew exactly where home was.